House Democrats are preparing another public rebuke of Minnesota Democrat Representative Ilhan Omar after weeks of controversy surrounding alleged anti-Semitic remarks by the Congresswoman. On Monday, reports from Washington said top Democrats in the House were considering a vote this week on a resolution condemning anti-Semitism. A draft of the resolution obtained by the New York Times does not mention Omar by name, but appears targeted at her recent remarks and their fallout. Omar responded to a tweet from journalist Glenn Greenwald, who posted about the House GOP leader Kevin McCarthy threatening to punish Omar and other congresswomen for being critical of Israel. Omar wrote back, "It's all about the Benjamins, baby," a line about a $100 bill from a Puff Daddy song. Critics jumped off the tweet and said Omar was calling up negative and harmful stereotypes of Jewish Americans. In another tweet soon after, Omar named the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, or AIPAC, saying it was funding Republican support for Israel. This tweet received bipartisan backlash, and Omar was widely accused of anti-Semitic speech. Omar apologized and said she was learning about the painful history of anti-Semitic tropes, but held on to her criticism of AIPAC's lobbying. The latest controversy comes from Omar's remarks at a Washington bookstore called Busboys and Poets last week. The comment in question refers to the weeks of controversy that followed Omar's earlier criticism. She said, "I want to talk about the political influence in this country that says it is okay for people to push for allegiance to a foreign country. I want to ask why it is okay for me to talk about the influence of the NRA, National Rifle Association, of fossil fuel industries or Big Pharma, and not talk about a powerful lobbying group that is influencing policies." Again, Omar was accused of anti-Semitism. Jacob Bacharach is a Jewish-American author based in Pittsburgh. He wrote an op-ed today on the website truthdig.com saying the criticism of the left for anti-Semitism has become its own dog whistle.
I just see a political habit in American politics and media of greater scrutiny to rhetoric on the left, particularly surrounding Jewish issues and the state of Israel, than you'll see from rhetoric on the right.
Yeah, I've noticed that too. I've actually felt it myself. If you compare something Trump does to fascism, or say the optics of putting children in a camp remind one of maybe the early days of the Nazi regime, everybody's jumping on your back like you said the worst thing in the world, and yet it doesn't seem that way when you look back on it. What is that all about?
No, and actually, that's probably a pretty good example, because there as well you'll see that there's a fairly broad swath of conservative commentary that effectively accuses not just the left in the United States, but even mainstream liberalism of basically being Stalinists. And you rarely see the kind of round condemnation of that sort of rhetoric as you do of people saying, well, yeah, Trump appears to be sort of maybe proto-fascist, if not actually fascist.
Right. What's behind all that? And why do they get away with it?
Well, I tend to think that most of the sort of legacy press in the United States is just unduly deferential to the political right in general, and I think that is the result of a combination of things. One is just the fact that the right have been effectively working the rest by complaining about media bias to anyone who will or won't listen for the last 30, 40, 50 years, and I think that has an impact on the way that news and current events are covered. But I think that part of it, too, is the fact that while it's fair to say that a lot of reporters and journalists have some cultural liberal biases, they are, at the end of the day, largely professional people in the United States. They identify with the relatively well-to-do professional classes and tend to be actually more conservative in their outlook, I believe, than the sort of mainstream criticism of the media as being the sort of hotbed of liberalism would have you believe.
And Representative Omar, what she said, well, tropes. I mean, how can you say anything that's not a trope, but yet the President of the United States said that a bunch of people screaming the Jews will not replace us were fine people, although he tries to hedge on that nowadays. He's had many he used on his own campaign literature, really anti-Semitic tropes that were like right in your face. Forget exactly what it was, but I remember it was something on his campaign literature, and he'd never apologized to it. And then also, he was friends with a neo-Nazi down in Louisiana, political David Duke, who's well-known neo-Nazi, refused to apologize.
Yeah, I mean,
you say Benjamin, and everybody's on your back for that.
Well, I mean, there again, I think that it seems to me that the Trump White House and that larger political movement has quite evidently cozied up in many ways to these characters on the sort of extreme right, far right, alt right, whatever term you want to use for it, who have explicit anti-Semitic biases, but who in some very interesting ways tend to sort of check those biases at the water's edge. In fact, if you look at characters who have been broadly supportive of Trump, even though he himself has not explicitly embraced them, and that would be people like, say, Richard Spencer, who sort of construct themselves as ethno-nationalists, white nationalists, they have actually praised Israel, even as they sort of revel in anti-Semitism. They say, Israel is a good example of exactly the type of sort of mono-ethnic state that they want, and so there's an interesting contradiction there where the sort of circle gets squared by this political movement permits both a sort of fairly virulent anti-Semitism toward Jews and the Jewish people, even as it really presents itself as being sort of hardline in support of Israel as a political entity.
And of course, there's the evangelical Christians who have almost like a dark vision where Israel's at the heart of it.
We're like the primer switch before they actually pull the ripcord and start up the apocalypse, and it's always struck me as being one of the dumbest strategic moves that conservative Jews and many American Jewish supporters of Israel, and frankly many Israelis as well, have made, which is to sort of ally themselves in this sort of common cause of convenience with American right-wing evangelicals who have really a pretty deranged notion of what Israel is and represents on the world stage, and a really questionable reason for quote-unquote supporting Israel.
Are you aware at all, can you tell us, enlighten us what people in Israel think about what they hear when they hear this stuff in the United States? You know, the middle class, people who aren't extremists one way or the other, just were born there and live there.
Well, I mean, unfortunately, I would say that, the majority of my Israeli friends and acquaintances come from the dwindling Israeli political left, and they tend to look askance at a lot of this stuff the same way that many leftists in the United States do. But as I said, regrettably, it seems to me, and this is as an American and as an outside observer, I'll include that caveat, that not just Israeli politics in the form of the government, the Netanyahu government, but Israeli society in general, more and more politically, culturally, and socially right-wing, and frankly has embraced not just Trump, but a number of other far-right characters in governments throughout the world. Jair Bolsonaro down in Brazil, Viktor Orban, until a recent flap, even sort of cozied up to the right-wing government in Poland, although there have been some flaps that have seemed to have driven a little bit of a wedge in that relationship now. So, I think that there's a really stark divide in Israeli politics, as there is here, between those on the left who, want to see some fairly radical changes in the pursuit of peace and equity, and unfortunately what appears to be, if not a majority, at least a very strong plurality in that society, and as reflected in their politics, that has no particular interest in any type of peace, whether a negotiated two-state solution or some type of one-state solution, as people increasingly talk about, but are simply seeking to delay until eventually, I guess in their minds, the Palestinians give up their sort of legitimate aspirations to freedom and statehood of their own.
It seems to be a reliance on the massive military might represented by a U.S.-Israeli alliance in this region. All we have to do is just keep the road, and eventually our money and our power, and we're talking about the United States here, will win.
Yeah, and actually I think that's an important point, and it's one that I like to emphasize, which is that I actually do think that the one, so if we're talking about anti-Semitic tropes, I think that one of the problematic things that you do sometimes hear on the American left in particular are people sort of insinuating that Israel, through the lobbying power of AIPAC and through its own sort of nefarious political influence is sort of Svengali-like controlling the government of the United States, when in reality I think that we, really have to confront the fact that Israel as a client state of the United States, and that far more than the American government somehow doing the bidding of Israel, Israel, like many American client states, is really acting in a way that supports larger imperial American foreign policy. And I think that that's an important distinction to make, because I do think that we trip into dangerous territory when we begin to suggest that, the sort of this relatively tiny state in the Middle East is sort of exerting undue control over the vastly more powerful and influential American government. I think that rather it's no less troubling, but sort of vice versa.
Should we give credit to the Tsarist government for coming up with the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, one of the most amazing, effective racist tropes in history, still to this day?
Yes, well, I mean...
It's red. You can buy it on the streets of New York. I'm in Brooklyn right now. I can walk down the street and buy one in 5 minutes.
You can find them in used bookstores. It's pretty incredible how durable that's been. Unfortunately, as I said in the piece that I published today, how a legitimate sensitivity to the sort of slightest hint of anti-Semitism, which is a sensitivity that I understand as a person and as a Jewish person, can be utilized so effectively in the case of Representative Omar, for example, to really shut down legitimate political discourse and legitimate criticism, not just of the state of Israel itself, but in her case, if you look carefully at what she said, of the expectations of representatives here in the United States and of the expectations of what they support and believe in terms of American foreign policy. And I keep coming back to that because I think that that's really the fundamental issue in this debate here, is
right.
That at the end of the day, we're talking about American foreign policy.
And that's what she's bringing up. So do you think that generally her statements, although they're getting so many attacks, they're actually legitimate statements she's making?
Yeah, I mean, I think that she has. I think that she has spoken somewhat inartfully. I will say that, and I think that is a legitimate critique. I think that oversensitivity on these issues is regrettable but understandable. And again, I say that as a Jewish person who has some of those oversensitivities myself. But I think that the fundamental underlying points that she's making are correct, and I think that she is being deliberately interpreted in the most uncharitable possible light by people who are opportunistically seeking to score points for their own political ends.
Great. Thank you very much. Maybe, is there any hope, that this whole situation, not just Omar, but, can we ever come to some, or is things heading down the rabbit hole right here?
Well, I tend generally to be a pessimist, but let me try to end on a hopeful note here. Yes, I actually do think that what we have seen over the last several weeks, and in fact with some of the new leftists who are coming into power and into prominence in the Congress and in political movements across the United States, is at least a slight loosening of the extremely constricted rhetoric around issues of American foreign policy vis-a-vis Israel and Palestine, and that many things that previously had been totally unutterable are at least now being slightly debated within the public square. I think we have a very, very long way to go, but if I have to end on a hopeful note, that's my hopeful note.
Jacob Bacharach is a Jewish-American author based in Pittsburgh.